As lockdowns continue and alienation and isolation increases, we ask, is the mental health crisis the real pandemic? And is anybody profiting or benefiting from this crisis?
A recent national study found the rate of depression has doubled on last year. The virus hasn't just increased loneliness, but also anxiety and uncertainty.
Doctors, charities and the police have warned of a rising tide of distress. According to research by the UK Centre for Mental Health, a staggering 10 million people, almost 20% of the population, will need either new or extra help as a direct consequence of the crisis.
There's nothing like a blank staring mannequin facing down a cold and empty high street to conjure the image of a culture gone wrong. Some facts about mental health in the pandemic. The coronavirus crisis is said to pose the greatest threat to mental health since the Second World War. Calls to mental health helplines and prescriptions for antidepressants have reached an all-time high, with more than 6 million people in England receiving antidepressants in just 3 months, the highest figure on record. Meanwhile, in the US, the pandemic has seen a tripling of anxiety symptoms and a quadrupling of depression among adults compared with the previous year. Nearly half of Americans report the coronavirus crisis is harming their mental health, according to a Kaiser Family Foundation poll. A federal emergency hotline for people in emotional distress registered a more than 1,000% increase in April compared to the same time last year. I've noticed myself, even in the position of comfort and privilege that my life affords me, that it's getting bleaker and darker, and I can see and feel the exacerbation of existing conditions. It's sort of evident to me that this type of lifestyle, if you strip away, of course, the obvious beneficial things like social interaction, it's clear that that would have an impact, but not to mention the kind of placebos and distraction that are provided by consumerism and like eating out and ordinary everyday activity. These two are taking their toll.
Those worst affected are from disadvantaged backgrounds and discriminated against communities. Health charities are crying out for extra government support for mental health, but state funds are already overstretched, shielding the economy from ruin.
It's interesting that shielding the economy from ruin is a priority over the physical reality of people's mental health. It's interesting how the conceptual world of economics is a priority.
Mental health experts are sounding the alarm on the impact the coronavirus is having on us mentally. The CDC releasing a report showing 40% of Americans are dealing with anxiety or depression. Those numbers even higher for young adults.
I mean, I think that there's a mental health crisis long before this pandemic, and writers like Mark Fisher have at length described how we have created social, political and cultural conditions that exacerbate addiction and mental health problems. Sebastian Junger's book Tribe talks about that as well, that we live in conditions that are almost perfectly devised to create addiction and depression, in that we feel disconnected, alienated, competed with, disconnected from nature, both inner and outer. But the pandemic has certainly amplified those conditions, and the statistical information in this video makes that clear. I suppose the thing that interests me is, why is it that these questions are not being more explicitly posed, and why are we not looking for solutions? Is there a parallel narrative during the pandemic around people that are benefiting from these conditions that can perhaps provide some light on this subject?
Billionaires have added over $730 billion to their wealth since mid-March, with the top 3 billionaires now worth more than the bottom half of the entire American population.
I think it's worth observing that whilst this pandemic has exacerbated an already existing mental health crisis, it has also contributed to an increase in wealth in some of the world's wealthiest people and institutions. For example, billionaire wealth grew by $637 billion during the pandemic, whilst more than 40 million Americans filed for unemployment. Billionaires saw gains during previous crises, such as the 2008 crash, within which 8.8 million Americans lost their jobs. Between 2009 and 2012, incomes from the bottom 99% grew 4%, whilst the income of the top 1% grew by 31%. This was due to the government giving more aid to banks and corporations, and therefore the wealthy having more money to invest when the markets recovered. With interest rates lowered to near zero for the next decade, the rich were able to make huge profits. By 2020, the combined wealth of the billionaire class in the US had increased by over 80%, while 4 in 10 people didn't have enough cash in their account to cover a $400 expense. In response to the coronavirus crisis, interest rates were again lowered to near zero, meaning this pattern will continue. This is a cycle that's occurred time and time again, with the 2010 Haiti crisis when 95% of the relief aid ended up going to American construction companies. Combined with their huge investment and purchasing power, billionaires also gained from well-friendly tax laws and loopholes such as limited liability companies which protect the debts from business downturns. In fact, taxes paid by billionaires have decreased by 79% since 1980, and that's without factoring in the 32 trillion being held offshore by the world's wealthiest people.
We got in touch with all 58 mental health trusts in England. 32 replied. Of those, 60% said they had cut the number of beds.
Mental health services are strained. Charities fear we're storing up trouble.
We've had services that have been absolutely threadbare before COVID, and now people feel that they can't receive help. People have relied on being monitored with telephone calls. Often they just wait and the call never comes.
Since 2011, mental health trusts in England have suffered budget cuts of over 8%. We have lost almost a third of all NHS health beds over the past decade, and 6,800 mental health nurse posts have gone. The NHS Confederation has said current government funding is not sufficient to sustain services amidst an increase in demand and costs caused by the pandemic. In 2019, the US spent $225 billion on the mental health market. I suppose one interesting back of an envelope piece of mathematics is that during the time that $637 billion has been accrued by billionaires in the US, $225 billion has been spent on the mental health market. Whilst you may not be able to resolve the mental health crisis by using the money that has ended up going to the wealthiest institutions and individuals in society, you could at least treble the expenditure on mental health by reapportioning that money. So millions of people that have not had mental health problems before are experiencing mental health problems now. Loads of people that have always had mental health problems are experiencing them in a worse way than ever before. And even people that wouldn't declare that they have mental health issues are feeling frustrated, angry, and suspicious. And perhaps that might be in some part because there's a sense that this lockdown is not impacting everybody in the same way. In fact, whilst it's punishing and punitive for some people, perhaps you could argue the most vulnerable people in the world, some of the most powerful institutions in the world are being advanced by it, are benefiting from it, and have no incentive at all for this situation to change.